77268. Council, go ahead and make your formal appearances for the record.
Mark Giacomo and Carlo Pesci for the state.
Morning, Honor, Tom Harrington, Tom Pitaro for John Valerio, who's present.
All right, I understand there are a couple things we need to discuss quickly.
Yes, Judge, last night when I went back to sort of address the issue that we have with State's Exhibit number 80, which I would note has been redacted in conformance, and we made the highlighted copy of Court's Exhibit, and that Exhibit number is 2, so that there's a record of what you require to be redacted. I ran an NCIC, which confirmed the information that I then found in its prison records, which is the 1986 PSI, which is that there is an 83 misdemeanor theft and an attempt use of credit card, which is what the subject of that detainer was. And he received 20 days in jail on count 1 and 20 days in jail with 6 months probation and restitution on count 2, which is the one that he was here in Las Vegas for while in probation in Arizona when he committed the the Frederick Henderson one. And then the 83, August 31st, 83, that's a separate offense of felony theft, which was amended to a misdemeanor and suspended. I went through, took out the March of 83 one that was referenced in here that there was no disposition for the show denied or dismissed. And I took out the plea bargaining section, and I took out the evaluation consistent with your 1984 order, and I've marked that PSI as 82.
Okay.
I provided a full copy, if you also see the redacted copy, to the defense, but those are records I got from them, so I imagine they will have them. The other thing is, odd things happen in trials. So for the last 20 years, or last 10 years or so, we have been looking for State's Exhibit number 20 from the original trial. This morning, a box was delivered to our appellate division. Where it came from, I have no idea, but in that box there were some old photographs, one of which was State's Exhibit number 20, with the exhibit marker still on it. That is a picture of Karen and the daughter when she's approximately the age at which she testified. I've had that marked as State's Proposed Exhibit number 81. We've shown it to counsel, and I intend to offer that based upon the court's ruling before. I didn't want to do it in front of the jury without addressing it with the court.
Okay. Anything else?
There's something as it relates to the defense case, but that would complete our case. The admission of those two items would be the completion of the state's case. I don't know if you want to address that first.
All right, let's go ahead. Anything you want to say in terms of the 80, which year?
81 and 2.
Yeah, 82. Or 81.
Your Honor, so 82 is the pre-sentence report from, it's dated February 18th, 1988. We made our objections to that yesterday.
Okay, I recorded the redactions referencing the one 1983 warrant that there was no determination on, striking the plea negotiations and the evaluation. Is there anything else that you had a particular concern? Those are the only ones you mentioned yesterday.
There's one item, Judge. I just realized that when you said the date that this was prepared, the murder shows the sentence, so I'll have to redact that and get a clean copy of 82 before we send it back to the jury. Because it shows for this case he was sentenced to death on January 22nd, 1988.
And Your Honor,
Okay, that will be stricken or redacted.
we do not have a copy of the proposed redacted version, so if we could get that to look it over one more time and make sure there isn't anything else that was missed in the redacting process.
All right. There was also, I redacted, I remember yesterday, a reference to a felony warrant that ultimately was pled down to a misdemeanor.
That's in 80, not in 80.
Yeah, I didn't know if it was a repeat of it by chance in the newest one that you found.
No, because that warrant had been cleared by the time this one had been
All
created.
right, I just didn't want to have that. All right. Kelly, if you're listening, could you have John come out and let's run a copy of that?
Just let me redact that one thing at that, and then I can email it to Kelly,
Okay.
and that would allow that to be printed, and we can remark it as 82. And I can also email that to the defense.
Let's go ahead and have John make a copy.
Take out those second issues of the second
All right, I'll go ahead and admit those. I'll let the defense have a look over the defense's objections as previously stated. I'll let them have a look, though, at the Exhibit 82 to see if there's anything else additionally they want redacted.
And Your Honor, just for clarification, this pre-sentence investigation report is the only pre-sentence investigation report that's being introduced into evidence?
No. Yesterday, the 84 was admitted, that's the 86.
81's over here. Why don't you come over here and take a look at it, counsel, and make sure we are all on the same page.
I don't have 81, I have 80.
Oh, all right, but
This is 80.
what are the numbers for the two reports?
80 and 82.
Okay, so I'm sorry, 80 and 82.
That's the unredacted.
Oh.
That's the redacted one. This is unredacted.
Your Honor, it's my understanding that it was agreed that on the last page where it has the United States Department of Justice criminal history report, that
The top one, 83, was supposed to be, I don't remember if I did that yesterday or not.
You didn't highlight it, but I have no objection to just removing that back page,
All right, we'll remove the back page.
because the information is contained elsewhere within the two documents.
so that
So, this one, we look at the documents, I can read it.
And I'm just emailing the new redacted 86 to this,
And I'm just going to attach it to the, so
So this is the 6.
You don't have these 86 up there?
no, that's
82.
exhibit
I'm
82.
emailing it right now. I accidentally tried to attach.
You have the, why don't you show it to them so they can start doing any final comparison, look at that.
So this is the one with the redaction.
Just email it to her, but look at the page and it'll show where it says the sentence that's
So in addition to the ones that are on there, we took out
right there.
the new sentence.
So turn that page on, we'll see 10-4-86. In the criminal history, the last one. So this is the felony after that. Is there another spot you're looking for now?
You know, I'm just looking at this thing. Recommendation.
Those are in both, Tom.
I'm sorry?
They weren't excluded from the other one either.
The recommendation, I thought
The evaluation was removed by you, you left
Right,
the
I left
recommendation.
recommendation in, okay, I had,
Where does recommendation?
yeah, I'll strike the recommendation.
Do you want me to redact it again?
Well, as long as we're on agreement, we'll go ahead and admit it, but that understand, we aren't going to be showing it to the jury, I assume, at any time prior to closing that.
Well, I promise not to show the recommendation to Dr. Rickman.
Okay,
Well, I don't want to introduce some evidence.
sorry, go ahead.
The other minor thing that we believe needs to be redacted,
You're on 82, right?
Yeah.
yes. On page 4, it has the title plea bargaining is still in there. What was underneath it was removed. We just asked the heading be.
I'll just strike the heading plea bargain.
Despite that's in the exhibit with the JOC. The entire plea bargain is in the exhibit with the JOC and highly relevant to a sentencing proceeding.
He's charged with more than one crime, but
And he pleads down to a different, to a lower crime, and that is included in.
Well, I mean, the heading is the only thing that's in there, right?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's not going to make or break anything.
Well, it's not gonna make a difference, I was just,
Yeah.
it doesn't,
Yeah, just get rid of, well, I'll go along with the council, get rid of the heading plea bargaining. Anything else? That's 80 or 82, Mr., that we haven't discussed already, Mr. Harrison?
Your Honor, nothing in addition to the objections we made to yesterday.
Okay, and then just a note for the record as to 80, Mr. Erickson mentioned, something in reference to the last page, which was the DOJ rap sheet, and we just agreed by the parties would strike that last page. All right, what else does the state have?
We have to address 81. We're going to offer the picture of Karen near the time period that her daughter is 8
Is there any
years old.
objection to the 81?
Yes, Your Honor, it's the same objections that we had yesterday regarding photographs that are
Okay.
unduly prejudicial, more prejudicial than probative. This is a photograph that apparently the state came into possession of, or this morning, at least these prosecutors. It's a picture of the victim, the daughter, and Santa Claus. I think it's been more than established that the victim had a 9-year-old daughter at the time of the crime, and the testimony of the daughter has been introduced in this photograph of Santa Claus.
I can't remember, there was another picture I allowed of the mother and daughter.
And the ex-husband. There is a picture of those three together.
As an infant, and you ruled the other two were
Yeah.
inadmissible because she was an infant.
Yeah.
I would note that Kane v. Tennessee makes victim impact.
No, yeah, and that's why, you know, she was an infant and long before where there was an impact here. So, I mean, the fact that she had a relationship with her mother as an infant, I found to be somewhat tangential, repetitive to the issue here. But this is, you're saying approximately the time that she was,
Correct. According to the trial transcripts, this is what she looks like at the time of, and that was the
All right.
argument to the district court.
anything else you want to add to your objection?
What is that, Santa Claus? Another Santa Claus.
Your Honor, it's our understanding that the prior picture, well, let me ask you, was this picture introduced at the time of trial?
That is Exhibit 20 from the guilt phase that was introduced over objection of the defense.
The last thing I would say, just the inclusion of a picture with Santa Claus, what we think is just unnecessarily and overly prejudicial and outweighs any probative value there.
Okay, I'll overrule and admit Exhibit 81. Anything else from the state?
Just as it relates to the defense case, at least for today, they intend to read in some testimony, and I assume they're going to call some family members as well. In reviewing that testimony, there are certain violations of a case that came out after this case called Kazmarek, and that site is 120 Nevada 314. In Kazmarek, the Nevada Supreme Court not only affirmed that a victim family can't ask for a particular punishment, but either a defendant, defendant's family, or any other person can ask for a particular punishment in a capital sentencing phase because it's not relevant to the determination of this jury what their opinions are as to what the sentence should be. And so I would request that any read-in transcript be redacted to any references to, you know, please let my brother live, you know, if he dies, I die, those types of things that are now excluded pursuant to Kazmarek from victim families being, or defendant families being able to ask the jury.
Have you told them what transcripts you're going to be reading?
Your Honor, we have, we provided copies of those to them, so.
All right, I mean, I hate to be sitting here going, don't do any of that. You know, is there something in those transcripts you got a particular concern about, Mr. Giacomo?
Yes, and in fact, the only one I have concern about is Jewel. There's a series of questions asked. Some of her answers are appropriate, but the question asked, and this is on page 44, so the very end of her testimony, it says, what do you think he will do with his life? What will he do if he's allowed to live? Answer, I think if you let my brother live, he can contribute to society because I know when I saw my brother, I saw him a little while ago, it hurt me. How do you think he can contribute to society? And she has an answer, some of which was admissible, but at the end she goes, because we all love him, all his family loves him, and if he dies, we die too. I'd ask that you redact that statement, and only that statement, to be honest with you, it's just that limited statement, which is clearly a plea to this jury not to kill her brother.
Mr. Everson?
Yeah, we would submit on that request.
All right, I'll strike that's the only part.
That's
He
the only
dies,
part.
We die too. All right. That's so much easier. All right, anything else?
No, we reviewed the other
All
transcripts.
right, anything from defense?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, let's bring in the jury. I'll be right back, Kevin, bring him in.
Okay.
All right, let the record reflect the presence of the attorneys for both sides, the presence of the jury. Did the party stipulate to the presence of the jury?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Your Honor.
Presence of the defendant, I needed to know. All right, let's see. Calling State of Nevada versus John Valerio, case number C077268. Counsel, please note your appearances for the record with the jury present.
Mark DiGiacomo, Giancarlo Pesci for the state.
Tom Erickson and Tom Pitaro with Mr. Valerio.
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
And the interpreter.
Oh, that's right, we need it. We still have the same interpreter?
Mildred Arquero.
All right.
Arquero.
And again, ma'am, you realize you're still under oath in terms of your interpreting in this
Yes,
procedure?
Your Honor.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your being here today. And I do appreciate it, and I apologize for us getting started a little bit late, but we will get moving and keep going for the rest of the day. Yesterday, I did allow the admission of exhibits 61, 62 through 76, 80, 81, and 82. Is there anything else from the state?
Yesterday, you did admit 81 and 82 in front of the jury. We offer state's exhibits 81 and 82. 81 is a picture of the victim and her daughter at the age near the time of 1986. And as well as 82 is the pre-sentence investigation report from the conviction for the battery with a deadly weapon involving Angela Howard.
Okay, is there any other objection besides those previously stated?
No, yeah.
All right, I'll allow, that's 81 and 82?
That's correct.
All right, I'll allow 81 and 82. Anything else from the state?
Not from the state at this time, the state rests.
All right, state rests, ladies and gentlemen. As I sort of explained at the beginning of the proceedings, when we were going through the jury selection process, the state goes first, and now the defense has the opportunity to go. The defense doesn't have to do anything. As I've emphasized before, and as was brought up a number of times during the jury selection process, the defense is under no obligation. And if the defense does nothing, presents nothing, that doesn't mean that you cannot find life with the possibility of parole or life without the possibility of parole. So the defense doesn't have to do anything. I always want to keep that point up. The defense has no obligation here. But they can do it. It's my understanding, as I spoke yesterday to counsel, that they do intend to present some evidence to you. So at this point, Ms. may present his first evidence.
The defense will call Sherman Hatcher.
Okay. Mr. Hatcher, if you'll come up here to the witness stand, stay standing for just a second once you get to the top step, and the clerk will swear you in.
Did you solemnly swear the testimony about to give in this action shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please be seated. Please state your name and spell your first and last name for the record.
Sherman Hatcher, SHRMAN HATCHER.
Scoot up just a little, Mr. Hatcher. Get you as close to that mic as possible. Counsel, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Hatcher.
Good morning.
Mr. Hatcher, can you please tell the jury about your employment background, please?
Okay, I'm a retired warden for the Nevada Department of Corrections. I started there in 1976, in May of 1976. I was a correctional officer. I worked my way through the ranks. I became a caseworker. I was a caseworker for a number of years, and then I got promoted to Associate Warden of Operations. Then again, I got promoted to Associate Warden of Programs. And in 1988, I became a warden out at the Gene facility. And since that time, I was a warden at 3 other institutions, including the warden camps. I was a warden at Southern Desert Correctional Center, Southern Nevada Correctional Center, the women's prison, warden camps, in Ely State Prison.
So, Mr. Hatcher, are you now retired?
Yes, I am.
What was the total time period that you worked in the Nevada Department of Corrections?
It was over 30 years.
And what is your formal educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree in psychology.
And you've used the term Nevada Department of Corrections.
Yes,
Is that often abbreviated in the system as NDOC?
that's correct.
Have you been retained to evaluate the case we're here on today of John Valerio?
Yes, I have.
And in your retention to evaluate his case, were you provided NDOC or Nevada Department of Correction records of Mr. Valerio beginning as early as 1986?
Yes, I was able to review his records.
And did you have the opportunity to do a thorough review of the approximate 31-year time period that Mr. Valerio has been incarcerated in the Nevada Department of Corrections?
Yes, I did.
I want to ask some more general questions, and then we'll focus on Mr. Valerio's situation from your evaluation. In the over 30 years that you were involved in the Department of Corrections, have you had the opportunity to review the disciplinary records of multiple inmates?
Hundreds of inmates, yes.
And can you describe for the jury the general disciplinary process of if an inmate gets in trouble, how that is written up, things of that nature, for the documentation in the inmate's records?
Yes, I can. There are different consequences based on what inmates' behaviors are. We have minor violations, we have general violations, we have major violations that inmates can commit, and of course the major violations are those that are most serious. And with those violations come consequences. It depends on the person's actions and what they actually did. A minor violation, for example, might be having someone else's radio. A general violation might be disobeying a direct order from a staff member. A major violation might be possession of contraband or weapons or hurting someone. Another general violation might be like a fight, just a general fight between two inmates. And each one of them carries different consequences. It may be a period of lockdown. It may be a period of confiscating their radio or TV or something like that. Or we might, if it's a visiting violation, we might cut their visiting for a certain period of time. If it's a major violation, the person may be in a lockdown status for a period of time. Up to, it could be a year or more. It could be 5 to 15 days or something like that.
And when you say a lockdown situation, describe what that means.
Disciplinary detention, we can lock a person down for up to 15 days where they don't have any privileges at all in their cell. They can't come out of their cell except for a shower, and then they go back in. And that's for a period of 15 days. In order to lengthen that, we have to go through another process in order to make that more. But that's going to be contingent on how that person responds. They could be on disciplinary segregation for a period of 1, 2, or 3 years based on their behavior. Now when it's like that, when that occurs, they have a few more privileges. Now, they're not locked down in their cell for 23 hours a day as they would be if they were on disciplinary detention. So we try to be humane in it, but at the same time, get that person's attention.
How does the prison system document incidences of disciplinary misconduct on the part of inmates?
We document it in their file. We maintain records of the write-up of the disciplinary report. We have it in computers now. You know, it used to be just on a hard copy that we kept in files. But as we progressed and got computers and things like that, we start to keep the records on file in a computer. And we also still have a hard copy of the file for each inmate.
And is it accurate to say that typically any type of disciplinary action of an inmate would be placed in that inmate's file?
That's correct.
I believe you testified that for some period you were the warden of the Ely Correctional Facility.
That's correct. Yes, I was.
And what was the time period that you were warden there?
I was there from the winter of 1991 through the spring of 1993.
Okay.
I don't know I can't remember the exact dates, but it was in that area.
Okay. And from your review of Mr. Valerio's NDOC record, what is your understanding of the facility that he has been housed at the majority of the time?
Okay, well, based on the review of records, you know, when he first got to prison, you know, he had some problems. And reading through his file, they weren't major problems or things that we would have a person locked down for long periods of time for. But he had some issues when he first got to prison. But as he matured, it looks like, based on his record, he started to have less and less problems. And for a period of years, I did see one thing in there in the early 90s, I think something I signed. I don't know what it was, I don't remember if it was a programming note or if it was a disciplinary note. But I didn't notice a lot of disciplinaries after like 1993. And of course I was gone after that point. But he went for a period of years and didn't have any issues.
And can you describe the general nature of the types of disciplinary actions that you reviewed in Mr. Valerio's NDOC records?
He had some general violations. He had a couple of major violations for having contraband. He had some minor violations, and contraband he had, as I recall, was he had fashioned a weapon out of a shaver, a big shaver. And he had taken the blades out and he had put them together. He claimed in disciplinary that he was using them for hobbycraft, which is not unusual because those kind of blades, if you know what they look like, if you take them out of that plastic holder, it's not much to it. So that's what he had. I think that was the most serious thing that I saw. I don't recall seeing anything with him having conflict with staff members. So I think his major one was that I saw was possession of contraband.
And you mentioned possession of razor blades and contraband. Those razor blades were those razor blades that were issued through the prison.
That's correct.
And do you know the approximate time frame that disciplinary infraction took place?
I don't recall which year. It seems like it's been 15 years or more
Okay.
that occurred. 15 to 17 years, something like that.
And in your review of his disciplinary records, is there any indication that Mr. Valerio had a direct threat to any other inmates?
No.
Is there any indication in his records anywhere that he had any threats towards any of the NDOC staff members?
No, there weren't.
Can you describe what you have observed with inmates who are brought into the system at a relatively young age in their lives, and what you often see as a progression in their behavior as they get older in the system?
Yes, I can. Generally speaking, almost all the time, youthful offenders, or someone who comes into prison in their 20s, early 20s, whatever, they're going to be problems. They're going to have problems initially, just adjusting. First of all, they're going to feel they're afraid. They're afraid because, you know, they're not used to being in prison before. They don't know what to expect. They assume that somebody's going to hurt them, and so that may cause them to act out at some point. As they mature, and as they get a routine going, and prison is made up of routines, and once a person gets a routine going, where maybe he can take some classes, or maybe he can go into a group or something and talk some things through, and to make his time easier, it's to his benefit. But that takes a period of time in order to get to that point. Because, you know, he's going to be challenged initially by inmates when he gets there, particularly as a young man. And so he's going to be challenged by inmates. Staff are going to be paying close attention to what he's doing, because one thing we look at immediately, someone, if he's in their 20s, you know, are they affiliated with anybody, a gang or anything like that? I didn't see any indications of that in his records, that he was affiliated with any group. So he eventually, after a number of years, he began to get fewer and fewer and fewer write-ups. And then after a point, I didn't see any.
Is it your understanding that from approximately 2000 that Mr. Valerio has not had any write-ups for disciplinary actions?
I think that's correct. I believe, if my memory serves, it was about 2000. It was in the 90s. 99, 2000, somewhere along in there.
Is there a term in the Department of Corrections vernacular of aging out?
Yeah, we call it aging out, but actually it's growing up.
Okay.
And
if you can describe to the jury what that generally means.
well, once the inmate figures out that he can't win, he goes ahead, he gets a routine. Like I said, prison is a routine. And once he learns what his routine is, he sticks with that, and it makes his time easier, okay? He'll probably get more privileges, you know, things that he wants in prison. You know, it's maybe some hobbycraft items that he wants to do. He might have a little bit more time. Once he starts to get visits, I never saw his visiting record, so I don't know if he got a lot of visits or not, but those can be taken away too if his behavior warrants. And, you know, in prison, everything is, we call it, his behavior indicates that he can do certain things, okay? If behavior indicates that he needs to be in a lockdown status, then that's what we'll do. If behavior indicates that he can have a little bit more freedom, he's not causing a problem for a period of time, then he's going to have that freedom, and he's going to be able to move about a little bit more, a lot more, based on what his behavior has indicated.
In your review review overall of Mr. Valerio's approximately 31 years in the Department of Corrections, how would you assess his conduct as an inmate?
Well, since the late 90s or early 2000s, he's been well behaved. I'll put it that way.
And even before that time, there was no indication of any violence from Mr. Valerio towards any staff members or any other inmates, correct?
No, there weren't.
Now, in contrast to the records you reviewed on Mr. Valerio, are there certain inmates who continue to cause problems while they're in the prison system?
Yes, there are.
And can you describe some of the things that you see on a regular basis, problem?
I see gang activities. I see dangerous weapons being made from things that they might find out on a yard and different places like that. I see inmates trying to manipulate staff to do certain things that are against the law. I see inmates continuing to smuggle drugs into the institution through either visitors or staff who have been manipulated by inmates, and that occurs. And I see violence towards other inmates. I see violence towards staff. Those are the kinds of individuals that eventually they'll do hard time. The time is when they're going to be in a status where they can't have as much contact with people as they might normally have if they behave.
Earlier you indicated that when a young offender is brought into the prison system, that they are often afraid when they're first introduced into the prison system. Can you describe to the jury as best you can the atmosphere that a young inmate is brought into and why that would often lead to fear with a young inmate?
Well, it's an atmosphere that he's probably not used to, unless perhaps they did time in a juvenile facility or something like that. But when you come in and you see these older inmates, they've been working out, they're buffed up, and they have a look about them. They got the tattoos, they got the things, and of course they know a little bit about prison. So they make some assumptions that they got to be tough too. So actually they're actually afraid. They're not being tough. they're afraid of what might happen. So they attempt to put on this facade of being a tough guy when they first get there, and in hopes of blending in. And they might get involved with a group or something just for protection. And they're assuming that they need protection.
From your review of Mr. Valerio's records, though, there's no indication that he got involved in any gangs or groups for protection, correct?
I didn't see anything in his record, no.
I want to ask you questions related to the parole process. If someone is eligible for parole, how does he or she get evaluated to determine whether or not they actually will receive parole?
The first thing that's done is we do a parole progress report. And that report is going to contain information about the inmate, what the crime is. It's going to indicate what his disciplinary record is. It's going to indicate what kind of programs he's been involved in as far as work or self-help program. If a person is a substance abuser, whether or not he went to counseling or did something like that. And There's going to be a release plan. If he intends to be released, you know, where he's going to work, where he hopes to work, where he's going to live. And all of that information is given to the parole board. And they have a system where they have points and they make a decision based on the points and how they feel about this particular individual. It's not totally scientific, but they do consider certain things as far as the program is concerned.
And is one of the things that is considered the likelihood of reoffense by the potential parole?
Oh yes, that's always a concern.
Now, if an inmate has a sentence of a number of years with the possibility of parole, is that person guaranteed that he or she will actually be paroled?
No, there's never a guarantee, no.
You're not going to have your
Sure.
indulgence one more?
Take your time.
Mr. Hatcher, I'm almost finished. Just one more follow-up question on the parole board process. Is it accurate to say that that is an individual determination for whoever the potential parolee is?
Yes, it is.
And how many members typically make up a board in their review of someone who has a life sentence if they're being considered for parole?
3.
And I think you've gone through a lot of the information that is reviewed by the parole board. In the facility, do you have professional counselors and psychologists, things of that nature that inmates have access to if they have mental health issues?
Yes, we do.
And does the board take into consideration any reports or evaluations from those professionals relative to a decision on the inmate is deemed a proper parolee?
Yes, they pay attention to what the psychologists and psychiatrists and medical department have to say. And that's general, that's made a part of the parole progress report. We have that information. The caseworker who's doing the report has that information. And if a psychologist decides to write something to the board, that's also permitted.
Okay. And is one of the main factors that's considered by the parole board the potential risk to reoffend of the parole?
Yeah, they have a risk factor scale that they look at, and they use that to help them to make a decision, but that does not determine whether or not a person is going to get paroled or not. That's just an aid that they use.
So that is one of many factors that are considered when they are evaluating the particular individual.
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
All right, thank you. Cross-examination.
Thank you. Good morning, Warden Hatcher. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Mr. Blackman.
I want to talk a little bit about sort of how this prison system's set up. So, at least way back in the day, Ely State Prison was the only maximum security prison the state of Nevada had, correct?
That's correct.
Now we have another one?
We have High Desert State Prison, which is has some areas, because it's so large, they use it as maximum security beds.
And when you're originally assigned to a maximum security prison, you go into what's known as administrative segregation when you first arrive.
That's correct.
Particularly if you have a very long sentence too.
That's correct.
And so the first period of time that you're in prison, you're locked down how?
You're locked down probably 23 hours a day, thereabouts.
And then you're 1 hour out, what's that like?
You get a shower, you get a phone call. And,
Do you have contact with other inmates during that time period?
it's possible. They don't allow the whole unit to be released at the same time. They might allow 4 or 5 people out at a time, 6 or 8 maybe.
And at some point, if someone behaves well enough, they get to go to general population, correct?
That's correct.
And then once you're in general population, there's a lot more freedoms that you have.
That's correct.
You may have a roommate.
You absolutely can have a roommate.
Right? There's not very many general pop cells that have just a single cell, right?
No, there aren't.
And then once you're in general population, you're going to have a lot more access to prisoners, correct?
That's correct.
And you probably have more access to guards, the bigger yards, those type of things.
That's correct too.
And if you behave yourself long enough, eventually you can even get yourself, moved to a different facility or a lower security facility.
That's correct.
Now, Mr. Valerio, in the last 31 years, has never moved to general population, is that correct?
I didn't see any indication that he had been moved to a general population.
The entire time Mr. Valerio has been in prison, he has been in a unit that has more controls than any other controls in the Nevada State prison system.
Yes.
And thus, his access to inmates and corrections officers have been much more limited than your general population prison.
That's correct.
And so we don't really have a history of what Mr. Valerio would be like in general population. Would you agree with that statement?
I'd have to agree with that.
So let's kind of go back. You sort of talked about Mr. Valerio's adjustment. Can we agree that Mr. Valerio was born in 1965? Those are in the record somewhere.
It's in the record, yes.
You'd agree with me if I represented
I
that?
agree with you.
Okay. And so if he went to the prison system 88, 89, somewhere in there, he's 23, 24 years old when he gets to the prison system, at least for the murder offense that we're talking about, correct?
That's correct.
Did you have records of when he went to the prison the first time for the robbery of Frederick Henderson that he went for 23 months for?
I only have the documents that we've been discussing. I don't know the prison terms.
If I were to represent to you that the documents provided to us by the defense start with his incarceration for this offense, would you agree with that?
As far as I know, that's the documents that I have.
Okay, so
As far as his prison record is concerned, I never saw a pre-sentence investigation, so I don't know a lot about his offenses.
And when he first got there, you sort of mentioned he had a few problems, right?
Yes.
And when we're talking about this highly controlled area, you mentioned that you had to, well, before you get to your report, let me back up. We can all agree that younger people behave less well in prison than older people as a general rule. Would that be fair?
That's absolutely correct.
And as they get older, they start learning that it's going to be a really hard time if I keep misbehaving.
That's correct.
And the prison involves itself in motivational techniques to motivate people to behave themselves, right?
Yes, we do.
Hold on just a second. Could you move a little closer to the microphone?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
And some of those rules might seem maybe strange to those of us who've never had to either work in a prison or live in a prison. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
Right? The rules that you guys have is in order to protect yourself, the inmates, as well as enforce order, correct?
That's correct.
So, for example, being in possession of Elmer's glue in your cell is something the department doesn't allow happen, correct?
That's correct.
All right? And that's because glue can be used as an adhesive, correct?
That's correct.
And that adhesive can be used to make shanks.
That's correct.
And shanks are what?
Weapons, knives, cutting instruments.
Guys are pretty ingenious on how to make weapons, knives, cutting instruments in prison, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
Alright. And so your rules are there to prevent that from happening.
Yes, it is.
And thus, even though it's Elmer's glue, it's a major violation if you're in possession of it, right?
That's correct.
So you talked a little bit about Mr. Valerio, and I just want to clear something up, and I think maybe this was an oversight, but did you review a report from 1993 when Mr. Valerio was 28 years old, in which he gets into an argument with the correctional guard and calls him a fucking punk?
I don't recall that specifically, but he had a long record, so a record over a period of time. So there are things I couldn't miss, no doubt about it.
Would you like to review to refresh?
Sure.
Alright. I'm going to show you what's a notice of charges from January of 1993 and ask you to just review that, read that to yourself and see if you've ever seen that document in the records. Now, in all fairness to you, there are thousands of pages of records, right? The department keeps every piece of paper they ever get on somebody.
That's correct.
In 30 years' worth, there's a lot of pieces of paper. That'd be fair.
Lots of paper.
After looking at it, does that refresh your recollection that there was an incident with Mr. Valerio where he called the corrections officer a fucking punk in 1993?
Yes.
And then you mentioned in your testimony that at least you saw a report by you, and I apologize, I meant to go in order here. You saw a report by yourself when you were the warden, correct?
That's well, I saw a report that I signed. I probably didn't do the report, but I did sign a report.
Okay. And if this is a situation in September of '92, do you recall, well, let me ask you this. When two inmates are arguing in the prison yard, what kind of security is there in the type of housing that Mr. Valerio was in?
There's gun coverage. There is gas. There are tasers, Nova Shields.
The gun a shotgun?
Pardon me?
Is the gun a shotgun?
Not anymore. Yeah, they used to have shotguns back then.
Back in '92?
Yeah.
So if two inmates are in an argument and the guard tells them to knock it off before it escalates and they don't, is there a continuum of force that guard uses?
Yes.
And eventually, does he wrap around into the shotgun?
If it's called for, if it doesn't break up by then.
If they don't listen, he wraps around in order to convince them, because the next step is to skip around off the ground.
That's correct.
Did you, maybe you don't recall this, but do you recall signing a report about Mr. Valerio being imprisoned in an argument with an inmate by the name of Devious, where he wrapped around, or where the guard had to wrap around to stop the argument between the two of them?
If that's the one that I signed, you know, that's something that I would sign if it was a use of a weapon involved.
Okay, because the department is going to document the use of their force and their force of their opinion.
Yes.
Would you agree with me that that happened, or do you need to see the report?
I agree with you that happened, because that's what would happen if things started to escalate. We try to make it de-escalate.
Now, when people get in trouble for these infractions, they may go back into ag seg for a while, right?
They will.
Okay. And the difference between the limited amount of freedoms that Mr. Valerio had in ag seg is that's 23 hours a day. Now you're just getting out into the yard 1 hour a day.
Yeah,
Okay. And when I use the word ag seg, it means administrative segregation.
that's correct.
And so, would you agree that until 1996, there's not much in the way of violations for Mr. Valerio?
I've seen records that were much, much worse than his. And he was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. However, you know, I've seen worse and I've seen better.
Well, the housing that Mr. Valerio was in, there's a defined group of maybe 80 to 90 people that are in similar housing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
have you reviewed those 80 to 90 people to compare him against Mr. Valerio, or are you comparing him against all the general population that have a lot more opportunity to do things bad?
Well, I compare him to the population that he was associated with.
So can you tell me the name of some individual in that population that had a worse one so I can check it against the record?
No, I don't. I don't remember names.
I'm going to jump forward to June of 1996. Now, you talked about that you recall an incident with a razor blade, correct?
Pardon me?
You said you recalled an incident with a razor blade, correct?
Yes.
But I want to go back farther. In 1996, didn't corrections officers search his cell because they received information that he had a shank inside his cell?
I do recall reading that.
And in 1996, despite the amount of controls that he had on him, when they went in, they found a 9-inch metal rod.
I don't recall specifically what they found. I know that they found some contraband.
Now, you sort of talked about this. A 9-inch metal rod is a danger to corrections officers, to other inmates, correct?
That's correct.
And that would be considered contraband and taken away from them, correct?
Yes, it is.
I'm going to approach and just ask you, June 24th, 1996, if you could review that and confirm to me that you were able to review that in 1996 he had a metal rod in his cell. Having reviewed that, does that refresh your recollection of reviewing that particular report?
I don't specifically recall it, but I read a lot of reports, and no doubt it happened because I'm reading it now and it's here. So.
And that report says that they received information that he had a rod in there that he was going to make into a shank, and they went in and found the rod.
That's correct.
This may be minor, but in those records, there's even inmate requests and things that inmates can ask for, correct?
That's correct.
And I'm sure you don't remember this, so I'm just going to approach with you. It's May 18th, 97. In 1997, Mr. Valerio requested a electric razor. Is that fair?
Yes.
And that's only just because I want to ask you a question about, you mentioned one razor blade, but let me start with February 21st of 1998. Do you recall reading that Mr. Valerio has had his own cell the entire 30 years, is that correct?
Yes.
That during a search of his particular cell, they found a can that had 4 razor blades, a large nail, a string with metal hooks attached, 3 needles, a straight pin, 6 paper clips, an eyeglass screw, 3 watch band pins, and a spiral notebook string, 1 needle threader, 1 spool of thread, and 1 strawberry tea bag with a red string tied around the top holding the above items in the can. You remember reading that?
Not specifically. I read a lot of stuff, and I don't doubt it.
Counsel, make sure that Mr. Erickson knows what you're showing here.
Thank you. And look, I don't doubt that it'd be hard to remember all these. I have them stacked up in order, it's the only way I can remember them. So I just want you to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting anything to you. Can you look at that and tell me if in 1998, Mr. Valerio had a number of items that could have been used to be fashioned into weapons?
I suppose some of these things could have been fashioned into one.
Certainly the 4 razor blades could have. February 21st of 1998, Mr. Valerio was written up for being involved in a fight with another inmate. Do you remember that?
Yes.
This is September of '99. Let me ask you a question about this. Mr. Valerio had his back window covered in 1999. What's the problem with having your windows covered at prison?
Because you can't see in the window. we want, the window should not be covered. Our assumption is that he's trying to hide something. He wants the cell to be darker for whatever reason.
And so the window we're talking about is the window, not to the world, but the window out to where the guards are.
Yes.
And covering that window,
Means you
doesn't
can't
allow-
see inside.
and that's a security problem.
Yes, it is.
Do you agree with me in September of 1999 he had his window covered?
Yes.
So let's jump to September of 1999. You sort of talked about this. There is an incident where now he has two razor blades kind of fused together, taped together,
Yes.
and hidden in an elbow.
Yes.
And you said that his excuse was that he was going to use it for hobbycraft or something.
That's what he said.
And looking at the records, he wasn't approved to have hobbycraft at that point in time, was he?
No, he wasn't.
And that was a major violation that caused him to go to administrative segregation again.
Yes.
And so 1999, now he's 33 years old, correct? 34 years old. Would that be fair? 65 to 99?
Yeah, that's correct.
You talked about major violations about drugs being smuggled into the Nevada Department of Corrections. Do you remember talking about that?
Yes.
In the records, it shows that in January of 2000, despite all the controls, despite the single cell, despite everything he tried, Mr. Valerio was able to have 2 packages of marijuana in his cell.
I recall that.
And then later, he was tested in January, a couple days later, they tested him to see if he was just in possession of it or if he was using it, and he comes up dirty on the UA. So he's smoking weed despite the controls you put on him.
That's correct.
Then we get to February of 2001, and this was the Elmer's glue situation. Do you remember reading about the Elmer's glue?
Yes.
And in fact, he had Elmer's glue hidden in a Physoderm bottle. So like a lotion bottle, so he was hiding the Elmer's glue in there for some reason.
For some reason, yes, he was.
And that was another major violation now in 2001.
Yes.
And then sort of after that time, the violations seemed to trail off. Would you agree with that?
I do. Yes, I do.
And sort of your assumption here, or what you've sort of said, is this is sort of consistent with inmates as they get older.
Correct.
You'd have been 36 in 2001.
Yes.
Now, might he have had some other motivation to reduce his violations?
Objection, Councilor Smith.
Well, if he, just asking if he knows of any other motivation that he might have had for, rather than might, does he know?
Do you know of any other motivation?
Yes. He might want to get his privileges back. Maybe he's decided that it's best to do it the department's way rather than his way. And there are any number of reasons. Obviously, he's been caught doing things when he first got to prison and during some of the times that he was at prison prior to like 2001. So he might be motivated to stop misbehaving in order to get more privileges or in order to hope to someday get a reduced custody.
In those records that you reviewed, there's a lot of things that the prison gets that may be unrelated to disciplinary and those type of things, correct?
Yes.
And some of those are the various orders entered in this particular case, correct?
Pardon me?
Some of those are the orders entered in this particular case, are in there, and you probably just flipped through them without looking real closely, correct?
Yes.
Your Honor,
May we have a slide up?
Okay. Go ahead, counsel.
Warden Hatcher, were you aware that in 2002, an order was issued which required this hearing that we're having here today?
No, I was not.
Judge, I'd ask you to take judicial notice of the 2002 order which required this particular proceeding.
Or, during another break, we'll discuss the exact nature of what the court's notice will be. I don't think you don't need that. I think to go further examining this witness.
No, I have just one more area. When you were the warden or within the system, had the legislature passed the PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and the risk assessments that they do?
Yes, I think they have.
So are you familiar with those?
Not anymore.
Let me see if I can. Gordon, I'm going to show you what's been marked as State Proposed Exhibit number 83. Just ask you to look at that and see. Well, one, you see that as a document that was within Mr. Valerio's prison records. Sir, do you recognize the first, that is a document that came from Mr. Valerio's file?
Yes, it has his name on it, so it came from his file.
And the Prison Rape Elimination Act is an effort to prevent one prisoner from raping another prisoner, correct?
That's correct.
And there is an assessment protocol that is done to determine whether or not someone's susceptible to being a victim or a perpetrator. Would that be fair?
That's fair. So, yes.
And that's the whole purpose of that particular document.
Yes, it is.
Okay. It isn't an assessment at all of anything else relevant to Mr. Valerio. It's solely an assessment of whether or not he would or would not be either a victim or a perpetrator of prison rape.
Well, I see the document as something that would help someone make a decision as to whether or not he would victimize someone or he has been victimized.
Okay. Well then, looking at that, the top one is an assessment of being a victim, and he scores out as a 0, right?
Yes.
Judge, I would permit 83.
Any objection?
May I look at the document?
Sure. Go ahead. You can come up and take a look at it. Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
All right, 83 will be admitted.
Now let me jump down to possible aggressor factors, which is the second one where we're assessing whether or not he's a possible aggressor. There's 4 criteria, correct?
Shock number just a little bit more to thank you.
Yes.
And he, on this form, scores a 1. And the reason he scored a 1 is because he has a prior history of violence. Is that correct, the number 3?
Yes.
Now, if you score a 1, this form says, you're a non-aggressor, correct?
Yes.
Now, there's 3 other possible 1s you could score, correct? And the first one is proof that you've actually sex assaulted somebody in prison before, right?
Right.
And if that's shown, you're a known aggressor, and that's your classification, correct?
Yes, and then get that from the pre-sentence investigation.
Can you pull the mic or get a little closer to the mic? I'm having trouble hearing your answer.
Okay, yes, that's correct.
And then the second one, read the second criteria there.
prior acts of abuse other than in institutional setting.
Are acts of sexual abuse other than in
Yes,
an institutional setting? So that's, if somebody's got a conviction for sex assault, they get a score of a 1 for that, correct?
that's correct.
But when the prison looks at someone's criminal history, they only get the judgments of convictions. They don't actually investigate the underlying facts and circumstances of the case, right?
No, we reviewed the pre-sentence investigation.
Mr. Valerio got a 0 for number 2, correct?
Yes,
If you were aware that he stabbed the victim in this case in the vagina, would you believe that to be a act of sex abuse outside an institutional setting?
Objection, Your Honor, that goes beyond this scope of this witness's expertise, and I think that there's not a...
I'll allow you to set some foundation to his familiarity with this form and the process of rating it, Mr. DiGiacomo, but based on what we have now for a foundation, I'll sustain the objection.
Ward, you just said that you get the pre-sentence investigation report and then you get the order. Now, the pre-sentence investigation report has sort of a, say, a summary of the offense, correct?
that's correct.
It doesn't have the specific necessary details of each and everything that happened during the course of the crime, correct?
No, generally speaking, it does not.
So if the prison doesn't have a document that tells them that Mr. Valerio stabbed a woman in the vagina, they wouldn't consider that a sex offense. Would that be fair?
Maybe I don't understand your question. Let me, could you...
Are you aware that Mr. Valerio was convicted of first-degree murder with use of a deadly weapon?
Yes,
As a warden, you were aware of the way that the department classifies individuals and their crimes. Would that be fair?
yes,
And someone who's convicted just of first-degree murder with use of a deadly weapon, they're not classified as a sex offender. Would you agree with that?
yes,
If the prison were aware that during the course of the homicide, the suspect stabbed, or the defendant stabbed the victim in the vagina with a knife, would the prison have considered that a sex offense?
Objection, Your Honor, that characterization of both the evidence and the charges that were originally brought against Mr. Valerio misstates he was never charged with any sexual offense.
And the record, I think, is clear that he was never charged with any sex offense. The question is, if this fact is established and there's some evidentiary basis that the jury can maybe find that that fact was established, it's up to them to determine what the facts are, would that have would the prison have categorized him as a sex offender, that this is a sex offense? He's indicated that he's familiar with the categorization process when he appears in court. I'll allow the question. Go ahead.
Would the prison have categorized him as a sex offense?
Actually, I don't think that we would have. We would have just considered it based on the facts what's in the PSI. We don't make any assumptions that he's a sex offender. Because of what the victim was stabbed, we base our entire classification of him on what the courts have found him guilty of and what the pre-sentence investigation indicates. If he's not convicted of a sex offense, then we don't just make an assumption that that's what he is.
Right?
Yes.
And so that's the reason why there's a 0 there.
Objection calls for speculation.
Well, ask him why there is a 0 in that. Let me just ask you, are you familiar with the process by which this form is completed?
This form is relatively new for the department. When it came out, I was actually working at the women's prison. It was not at Ely at the time. And so I'm not saying it's like 2 or 3 years old. It's been around for a while, and I've heard of it. But my first knowledge of it came when I was working at the women's prison and as warden, and but not when I was at Ely.
All right, well, let me just, my point, my question was, are you familiar with the process by which assessments that go into this report are made in order in order to score it?
I'm not familiar with this form. I've never used it. This is my first time seeing it. I've heard of it, certainly I have. But it's not a form that I've ever filled out. It's probably something that a psychologist would do for the department or a psychiatrist would do.
All right, I think we've gone over this form enough. Let's go on to something else, council.
Any more questions for the warden? Thank you.
All right,
Can you redirect?
Your Honor, may I continue?
yes, go ahead.
All right, Warden Hatcher, I want to go through some of the things that you were asked questions about by the prosecution. One of the things you asked about was a event that took place in 1996 regarding a 9-inch rod that was in Mr. Valerio's cell. Do you recall that one of the things that Mr. Valerio was allowed to purchase from the canteen was a radio?
Yes,
And back in that time frame, is it your recollection that those radios had a metal antenna attached to it?
that's correct.
And is it your understanding that what was found as the 9-inch rod was the antenna from the radio that he was allowed to buy from the antenna?
Yes,
And that radio antenna, there's no indication at all that it was sharpened or attempted to be made into a weapon, correct?
that's correct.
You were also asked about a number of items that Mr. Valerio had in his cell, that you were asked if they could be fashioned potentially into a weapon. You recall that line of questioning?
Yes,
In your review of the records and the reports from that incident, none of those items had been made into a weapon, correct?
that's correct.
You were asked about the 1998 incident report involving Mr. Valerio covering his window in his cell. Do you remember those questions?
Yes,
Your Honor, if I may approach to show him this report, well, let me ask this.
I don't have any problem if you show the report. Mr. Giacomo, you know what we're talking about?
I do, Judge.
Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Hatcher, if you would look at that report, what window in Mr. Valerio's cell was it that he had covered?
it's back window.
It was the back window of his cell, correct?
Correct.
So that was not the window that guards would look into to see what's going on in his cell, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so in his cell, there's the front area where the door in and out of the cell is, and there are windows in that area, correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Valerio did not cover the front windows where the door to his cell is, correct?
No, the report indicates the back window.
And just to be clear, if the front windows to his cell are not covered, then guards would be able to look into his cell, correct?
That's correct.
So, in your review of his records and what was brought out on cross-examination, Mr. Valerio has not had any write-ups since 2001, correct?
That's how I recall it, yes.
And in this assessment that was done by the prison that you were asked a number of questions about, that assessment was done May 21st, 2014, correct?
Yes,
And
I was.
you need to look at this, that's a pretty
I
specific.
can look at it again. I think I remember the one you're talking about with, yes,
If you just look and verify, when was that risk assessment done by the prison?
March 17, 2014.
And in that assessment, the prison
So this
scored.
is Exhibit 83, right?
Correct.
Okay, I just want to make sure I was right.
The prison assessment scores Mr. Valerio as a non-aggressor, correct?
Yes.
And this assessment was completed according to what's typed on here by a person named Mark Drain, D-R-A-I-N. Do you know who that person is?
I don't recall that person's name.
And at the time of the assessment, Mr. Valerio was 49 years old, according to this document. And I don't.
Yes.
So when I first began asking you questions, I asked you if NDOC, Nevada Department of Corrections, what is the term corrections? What does that mean from your perspective as a warden and somebody in that prison system for 30 years?
That means our main function is to correct behavior.
And the goal of the system is to help criminal offenders adjust and become, where they're no longer criminal offenders, correct?
That's correct.
And in your review of these records and the write-ups that Mr. Valerio had 17, 16 plus years ago, what is your assessment on how he has been processed through the system with the goal of correction?
I think that he has made significant progress since he was incarcerated.
Would you agree with this 2014 assessment that he should be considered a non-aggressor?
Yes.
The fact that an inmate has gone 16 years without a disciplinary write-up, what does that mean to you with your 30-year experience evaluating many inmates?
Well, that means to me that he's made it up in his mind, through lots of help, I'm sure, to change his behavior while he's incarcerated.
You were asked a number of questions about Mr. Valerio's interaction with other inmates while he was at the Ely State Prison. In the setting that Mr. Valerio was in, he had access and interaction with other inmates, correct?
That's correct.
And on a typical week schedule, how many times would Mr. Valerio be out with other inmates?
Every day.
And for at least 16 years with his interaction with other inmates every day, there's no record whatsoever of any violence on the part of Mr. Valerio, correct?
That's correct.
Sir, in your opinion, do you feel that Mr. Valerio has successfully navigated the Department of Corrections program?
I agree that in the last 16 years or so that he has made a significant change in his behavior.
And
that's to his benefit.
And you would agree with the 2014 assessment that he's a non-aggressor?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Reed Cross? All right, ladies and gentlemen, as I've said a number of times, you do have the opportunity to ask a written question. This witness, if you should desire to ask a question, write your question down with your juror number on a full sheet of clean paper and raise your hand. All questions must be factual in nature and designed to clarify information already presented. The marshal will pick up your question and give it to me. All questions must be directed to the witness and not to the lawyers or the judge. After consulting with counsel, I will determine if your question is legally proper. If I determine it is, I will ask the question. No adverse inference should be drawn if the court does not allow a particular question. Does any member of the jury have a question? Okay, I see some hands this time. All right. Clean sheet of paper, write your juror number on it. All right. Anyone? Okay. Counsel, can I see you at sidebar? Okay. Had a chance to confer with counsel. And again, as I said, if I don't ask a question from a juror after consulting with counsel, no adverse inference should be drawn if the court does not allow a particular question. I am going to ask you, sir, this one question. If a person spends the majority of their adult life in prison committing a serious crime, how often in your experience does that person return to prison after being granted parole?
Well, the rate of recidivism for someone who's been in prison that long is probably about average, 50-50. Maybe a little bit higher because he spends so much time in prison. But the people who are in and out of prison are the people who commit like burglaries, if they're considered to be like sex offenders, something like that. Those are the ones that reoccur the most. Most of the people, I don't have any statistics on this, I don't think any statistics have been done as far as murder is concerned, or something like that. But I see, over the years, I've seen very few people who got out of prison after doing 30 or 40 years or so come back, unless it's for like a minor violation, they failed to report. They didn't pay their fees, because inmates who are on parole have to pay a fee, a monthly fee. They have to maintain employment. There's all kinds of things that can cause them to go back. Most of the people who end up back in prison after they serve that much time are not back because they've committed a new crime. They're back because of a parole violation, not necessarily that they went out and killed somebody or they burglarized somebody, but it's because of something else they did. Maybe they left the state without permission. Maybe they didn't report to their parole officer when they were supposed to. Maybe they didn't maintain employment, and that's required up to a certain age. After you reach a certain age, it's not required to have to work anymore. but you're required to take care of yourself. You got to have a place to, like for you to have a place to stay. But most of the violations, the reason that I see people come back who have done that much time are parole violations, not because of new offenses.
Okay. Does that generate anything further from defense?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
Does that generate anything further from prosecution?
No.
All right. Thank you very much, sir, for your testimony here today. You are excused.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to go a little bit longer to avoid the lunch crowd down below. So I'll ask the defense to call it, put on its next evidence.
Your Honor, the defense would call Kate Stevens.
All right, ma'am, if you come up to the witness stand right here, there's a couple of steps. When you get to the top step, stay standing, and my clerk here will swear you in.
Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in this action should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Please state your name and spell your first and last name for the record.
Catherine Stevens, Kathryn, Stevens, Stevens.
And pull that microphone that you see on the box as close to you as we can get you, and so we can make sure we hear everything.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, counsel.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Stevens.
Morning.
Ms. Stevens, where do you currently reside?
In Charlemont, Massachusetts,
And approximately how long have you lived in Massachusetts?
35 years.
And I know that I probably will get in trouble by my mom by asking this question, but how old are you?
I'm 70.
You are obviously here testifying in a criminal trial. Please tell the jury how you know John Valerio.
I think late in 2008, early 2009, I had a friend who was writing someone in prison, and so she was getting letters on a regular basis, and I asked her how she did that, and she connected me with a kind of a pen pal organization, and so I started, I think our first communication was like February or March 2009, as just becoming pen pals with someone who was in prison.
Okay, so is it accurate to say that your first contact with Mr. Valerio was through writing in 2009?
Yes.
Okay. And I want to back up a little bit before I ask more specific questions about your involvement with Mr. Valerio. What is your educational background?
Let's see, I graduated from college in 1969, and then in 1982 I went to seminary and got a master's in divinity degree.
Okay. And where did you obtain your master's in divinity?
Harvard College.
And have you worked in an ecclesiastical capacity?
I've worked at 4 different churches. I just retired in June from 12 and a half years at my last church.
Okay. Now, with this pen pal relationship that you have had with Mr. Valerio, was that done in a religious or ecclesiastical capacity?
No,
Okay.
no, it was just, I learned this from my friend, and I thought, I just liked the idea of doing it, so I began writing just on my own.
Okay. So I would like for you to describe to the jury the contact that you've had with Mr. Valerio since you met through writing in 2009.
Let's see, Johnny's a better communicator than I am. He writes a little more often than I do, but I think probably we each write about once a month to each other, and I think we did that for about 3 years. And I think at that point, I don't know the exact date, but I have family out on the West Coast, and I made a decision to stop by the prison in Ely, Nevada to visit him. So then instead of just being a name and, you know, words on a page, we actually saw each other. You can have face-to-face visits there, so I got to know him a little bit. And since that time, we continue to write, and he calls me occasionally, and I have visited 3 other times. So I've actually had 4 face-to-face visits with him, as well as the ongoing letters. So he's become a good friend.
And when you say friend, you are married, correct?
I am.
And you live with your husband in
I do.
Massachusetts.
I do.
And he is aware that you have developed this pen-pal inmate relationship with Mr. Valerio.
Yes, of course.
And approximately how many times have you made the trip from Massachusetts out to Nevada to visit John in person?
4 times.
And when you've done that, who has covered the costs for your travel?
Me.
Describe for the jury your interactions with John as far as on a personal level of how you experienced him in the going on 8 years that you've been involved in his life.
I think the reason that we've kept writing and I've gone to see him is because we have an easy flow of conversation back and forth. That he's been an easy person to get to know, and he's thoughtful, and he asks about my life. He's gotten to know my husband. He's talked to him a number of times on the phone, and he asks about him. He asks about my life. He asks about my church. So it has really felt like a two-way friendship, which I think when I started, I don't know what I thought when I started writing someone, but I didn't know that actually we could become friends and that I would care about him, which I do.
When you describe for the jury, when you come out to Nevada for these visits, how they're set up at the prison as far as your interaction at the facility with them?
And at the Ely prison, it was like 2 days in a row you could visit, so I would go on one, I would arrive and I'd get to have like a 6-hour visit one day and a 6-hour visit the next day, and I would just stay in a motel and then go home, because then you can't visit after that time. So we get to, I don't know. Anyways, we could do face-to-face visits, which means we sit across from each other and there's a table and we tell each other about our lives. I guess we have an amazing ability to just talk, and we've spent many hours talking about our lives with each other.
During these visits, are there other inmates in the area interacting with their family or friends?
Yeah, of course. There's the guards, and then there's the tables with the people. And you're sitting across from the person, and you're blocked off from them. But you're pretty close. You're face to face.
Okay, and it's in an open room, correct?
Yeah.
What are some of the qualities that you have come to recognize in John Larry?
I find John a kind, thoughtful person who's concerned with others. He's always been concerned with my life and the life of the people. Because I was a minister, I would tell him about Mimi or someone who was ill, and sometimes he would send letters to them. He's very thoughtful. That's what I have found, a person who is kind, thoughtful, loving, and not self-centered. I find him helpful to other people. I felt like in prison, he would talk about other people that were having a hard time and how he could help them out. He made the most of his time trying to help other people.
When was the last time that you were able to do a visit while Mr. Valerio was in custody?
Just a few months ago, right after I retired, I came out here and visited. At that point, he was at High Desert Prison. And actually, that was not face-to-face, it was through glass with a telephone. So the other ones were face-to-face. I don't know if you call it face-to-face when you look through glass, but we were close, but we've got the glass and we've got 2 phones.
Ma'am, thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Cross-examination?
Ma'am, I apologize, I didn't catch, you said that you worked at 4 different churches?
I did.
Okay. Could you tell me about those churches, please?
2 were in Boston. One was, one was the city of Boston. One was Chelsea, which is just outside of Boston. Then we moved to a farm out in the western part of Massachusetts, which is a very rural area. So I live on a farm, and I've served 2 rural churches out there.
What denominations?
United Church of Christ.
And does that fall into, would it be a Methodist, Presbyterian, does it fall into a category?
It's its own denomination. It was, in New England, they were usually called congregational churches. But they combined with some other churches and in 1957 became the United Church of Christ, which is its own denomination.
And does that denomination have an official position on the death penalty? Will they oppose it or not?
I'm not positive. I'm guessing the United Church of Christ is a fairly progressive denomination, so my guess is at different times they've taken votes and probably made some statements against the death penalty. I don't know if they were blanket statements or maybe it was about for youth, or I'm not positive.
Okay, not positive, but I guess you're saying you instinctually kind of feel you would lean against the death penalty. Would that be
Would
the same?
I or the denomination?
Well, first we'll do the denomination, we'll do you, if that's okay.
Let's see, it's a tricky answer. I think maybe the denomination would lean towards against the death penalty, but it's a congregational polity, which means government, which means whatever the vote is on a national level, it doesn't necessarily influence the people in the pews. So you can find people all across the spectrum in any one congregation and throughout the whole denomination. So
Sure.
it's mixed.
And different religions have positions, and members within that religion could take a position different from the church's official.
Of course, yeah, and that's not true in all denominations, but it is true in ours.
And your personal feelings as far as whether you're for or against the death penalty?
Honestly, as a minister, as a believer in Jesus Christ, who I feel like was nonviolent and spoke about loving enemy, it's like I can never speak positively about the death penalty.
And then you come in here today and you testified about your relationship with Mr. Valerio and the interactions that you've had via pen pal interaction and also personal interaction,
Yeah.
correct? And then you characterized them based on your experience as kind, thoughtful, concerned with others, loving, not self-centered, and helpful to other people, correct?
Yes.
And then, I mean this respectfully, do you know the facts of the underlying charge that put him in prison?
Partially,
Partially.
yeah.
Would you agree with me that those characterizations that you're given probably wouldn't best describe the acts that got him here?
Right, I don't know if that, I don't know his relationship with the crime, honestly, but the little I know, the crime is something that was done by someone who feels very different than the person that I know.
Fair to say from what you just said that you don't know a lot about the crime or the facts of the crime?
I don't know a whole lot. It's not something that John and I talk about, and I don't ask. I feel like that's not exactly my place. I am trying to know him now, have a relationship with him.
Totally understand, and that's what I was trying to gather, is
Yeah.
whether you, in your relationship that you've created, you know those facts or you don't, and it seems that basically you don't, and it's not something you're choosing to get involved in as far as finding.
Basically, yes, that's
Thank you
true.
very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
9 years, is that right?
Yes, yes.
And you've obviously interacted with a lot of people over the years, and you're working in the ministry and things of that nature. Have you seen people change?
I've seen people change that have gone to jail. I've also seen people change whose lives were completely messed up because of addiction issues or criminal issues or lots of things. I do feel like we're all able to change.
Thank you very
I
much.
have to believe in that.
Thank you very much. No further questions.
Any recross?
No, thank you.
Does any member of the jury have a question for this witness? You? Write down a clean sheet of paper with your juror number and raise your hand. Not see any hands this time. Anybody? All right, thank you very much, ma'am, for your testimony. You're excused. You have a witness, be about 15 minutes, you think?
Your Honor, I am not certain. I need to check on still who's here at this point. So if we can take a break at this point, then I can make sure I've got the rest of them in there.
You will make sure we have somebody at 1:30.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, all right, we'll go ahead and then break. You may go, ma'am, I'm
Thank
sorry.
you.
I didn't mean to,
That's all right.
to stop you from leaving. All right, we'll go ahead then and break for lunch and get back at 1:30 and go the remainder of the afternoon. Let me remind you that until this case is submitted to you, do not talk to each other about it, about anyone that has anything to do with it. Do not talk with anyone else about this case or about anyone that has anything to do with it. Do not let anyone talk to you about the case or about anyone who has anything to do with it. If someone should try to talk to you, please report it to me immediately by contacting the marshal. Do not read any news stories or articles or listen to any radio or television report about the case or about anyone who has anything to do with it. Do not visit the scene of any events mentioned during the case or undertake any investigation, experimentation, or research on your own. This would include use of social media to in any way discuss the case, or the use of the internet or other reference materials to do any investigation or research. And do not begin to form or express any opinion on any subject connected with this case until it's finally submitted to you. So if you can get back as soon as you can by 1:30, we will get started at 1:30, and I really will get us started at 1:30 because I'm not going to let the attorneys leave until they assure me they've got everything that we need to get resolved before we get going at 1:30 to resolve. So with that, have a great lunch, and we'll see you in an hour.
All right, jury equity.